Hello again, friends. This is Mike, and welcome back to my podcast. I've been gone for a few weeks, and I'm glad to return and start podcasting again. Today's podcast is going to be about something I've never discussed before. It's about the appearances or apparitions of the Blessed Mother. And whether you call her Mother Mary, Mary the Mother of God, or the Blessed Mother, she's recognized as the Mother of Jesus in the Bible. And no matter what you call her, I think everybody understands who she is. So I want to talk about her well-documented apparitions here on Earth. That's coming up next. Hello again, friends and fellow truth seekers. Mike Nicholas here with another episode of the Soul Unleashed podcast, where my goal is to help you with the questions you might have regarding the awakening of your soul, and particularly help other left brain types like I am ask the right questions in our search for a deeper meaning to life. Ultimately, I want to help you unleash your soul from limiting beliefs and smothering paradigms. Let's get started with today. Today's podcast is going to be the first in a series of podcasts where I want to discuss the apparitions of the Blessed Mother. Now, I don't think this is particularly a Catholic thing, although I know that she's venerated, or I wouldn't say worship, that's the wrong word, but I know that in the Catholic tradition, she's recognized as Mother of God, of course, but there's many devotions to Mary and churches dedicated to Mary. You don't find that on the Protestant side of things, certainly not in other religions that are not Christian. So, although it's not a Catholic thing per se, I think the apparitions of Mary throughout the world has certainly arrested the attention of Catholics and Christians alike, and maybe the curiosity of people who are not Christian. But I want to discuss that and talk about some questions that I had about it. There are, of course, many experts on this subject and many books written about these apparitions, and I'll list some of those in the show notes for this podcast. There are supporters who write devotionals about these apparitions, and there are critics who think that these so-called appearances of the Blessed Mother are just a tool of manipulation for profit or for political advantage. And while it would obviously take a podcast of well over an hour to just discuss one of these books, I wanted to try and break things into manageable 15-minute or so chunks. I use this podcast to discuss things and questions that I have about spiritual matters caused by the awakening experience that I had following the death of our son in 2020. And I'm not an expert on Mary, I'm not an expert on the apparitions, and I approach this subject as a lifelong Catholic and observer who never questioned anything basically until I had the awakening. You know, as I've done this podcast over the past for more than a year now, I talked a lot about signs and symbols. Many of you know that have listened to my podcast that I started receiving what I interpreted as signs when I saw glowing, floating, blinking orbs in my home shortly after the death of our son. And that led to this whole spiritual thing that I'm on now. It led to the book. It led to this podcast. So I believe in signs. Some of them are very simple signs, like people finding dimes or pennies on the ground and believing that those coins represent a message of comfort, usually from a deceased loved one. I have a number of relatives that are always looking for dimes. They appear to come in pairs for my cousin, and she interprets that as a sign from her mother. Or people also see a cardinal or a butterfly or even a cloud formation. It may be something that they've asked for. There's a lot of gurus out there or spiritual teachers that tell you to ask for a specific sign from a loved one in spirit, and then you'll get that, and that will be a confirmation to you. But people ask for specific things just to show their loved ones are still in spirit, that they love them, they care for them, or just to prove that they exist wherever that existence is. I've also met people who hear a special song at just the right time, and they know that it is a message from their deceased spouse or their deceased lover. There are many books written about the phenomena of signs. Dimes from Heaven is one of them, and of course many others. I've also discussed in this podcast other more powerful signs, like the Emperor Constantine back in the 4th century. The specific date was 28 October 312 AD, to be exact. And he saw a sign in the sky, and he interpreted that as a divine message. He basically saw a cross, which is now called the Cairo, and he was told to put that on the shields of his men. It was a divine message to him to do battle at the Milvian Bridge, just outside of Rome, where he defeated another emperor called Maxentius. Thousands and thousands of soldiers perished that day, and Constantine became the protector and the champion of Christianity throughout the Roman world. In the Old Testament part of the Bible, in the book of Judges, chapters 6 to 8, it documents a sign that was given to Gideon. Gideon was one of the judges of Israel, and he received the sign from the Lord, and it led him to go into battle against the Midianites. And the whole story is pretty cool, actually, if you read it. Gideon had 12,000 men, and God deliberately whittled it down to about 300, and he went up against 150,000 men. And, honestly, I take some of the things I read in the Old Testament with a grain of salt, but Gideon went into battle, 300 against 150,000. He won the battle, and they killed 120,000 of the Midianites. If you heard any of my other podcasts, I talk about, how sometimes the Old Testament just really seems unfair when all the Hittites and the Midianites and the other people who aren't the chosen people have to go up against God, and they get wiped out. So anyway, 120,000 men were slain in that particular instance in the Bible. So there's all kinds of signs and differing messages, or certainly levels of importance to signs, right? People interpret them different ways. People do different things with them. Some people just derive comfort, like the whole dime thing, whereas others use signs to take violent action based upon the message they believe they received from Spirit. Now, of course, I don't disparage any of this. I don't condemn any of this. I've come to accept a lot of signs as I've gone through this transition. And spiritually, I used to think that all this was crazy nonsense. But now, of course, I'm more open to the possibility of signs being valid, especially since I've received some of my own. And that's what led me to this apparition thing. So with all this belief in supernatural signs from the Old Testament to you finding a pair of dimes today on your car seat, why would anyone be reluctant to accept the apparitions of the Blessed Mother as yet just another type of divine sign? Particularly when the ones I'm about to mention to you are well documented. I started thinking about the Blessed Mother, though, because I've been doing some genealogical research, and one of the items that belonged to my maternal grandmother was a small statuette of Mary, the Blessed Mother, at Lourdes, France. And kneeling before the Virgin Mary is Bernadette Soubirous, who witnessed the apparitions at Lourdes, which started in 1858. That's one of the apparitions we'll talk about. You can wind up this little statuette, and it plays the Ave Maria, and it's very old-sounding and simple. But I remember listening to it as a child. Even as a child, I was fascinated by the statuette, and that led to a fascination with the whole apparitions business. I'll see if I can get a picture of that and put in the show notes. Anyway, there were about 18 approved Marian apparitions. When you think about the ones, the obvious ones, Lourdes, Guadalupe, Fatima, I can only think about 4 or 5. And then when I did some research, there's about 18 approved Marian apparitions that have occurred since 40 AD. So the very first one occurred back in 40 AD. And there is one of importance that is still under investigation that I plan to include, and that's the one at Medjugorje. That's still taking place today. And there's some controversy surrounding that. So obviously I'm not going to discuss all 19 of these apparitions, but I'd like to talk about some of the more famous ones, and not only about the history of the apparition, that's pretty interesting, but more importantly, the messages that were conveyed by the Blessed Mother as part of these apparitions, right? She didn't just show up. Well, in a couple cases, she just showed up and didn't say anything, but in the ones we'll talk about, she showed up and she said things, and those messages were impactful to that particular time when she appeared. I mean, what was the purpose of her appearances, right? There were some very distinct and in many cases frightening messages. So I'd like to examine what they were and how the world reacted to them. They also impacted the political climate of the time, not just the faithful. So the apparitions that I plan to address in the future podcasts are Our Lady of Guadalupe, that took place in Mexico. I'm going to list these in chronological order. I'm not going to jump all the way back to 40 AD, the first one. But I'm going to start with Our Lady of Guadalupe, which took place in Mexico in 1531. Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal, which was in Paris, France in 1830. Our Lady of Lourdes, 1858. That's the one that's also in France, but that's the one with Bernadette Soubirous. Our Lady of Fatima, which was in Portugal in 1917, and Our Lady of Medjugorje, which started in 1981. So that's the one in Bosnia, and that continues today. I also plan to touch upon some unusual things. I want to talk about that. This just be very brief, but there's a name for this thing where people, I'll have to look it up, but people start seeing things. Like your mind is conditioned to look for patterns and to put things together. But anyway, there was something that occurred in Florida in 1986, and it's known as Our Lady of Clearwater. It was an image that appeared on the side of the Seminole Finance Corporation building, which was a glass building in Clearwater. And many people interpreted it as the Blessed Mother appearing on the side of this building. It was about 50 feet high, and it covered many windows, and it had iridescent colors, which made it glow, but it had like coloring to it. And my parents actually visited it. That's how I learned about it back in the day. My parents visited it and numerous times, and they sent us photos. If I can dig out one of those photos, I'll see if I can do that. But I know you can easily find it on the internet. So if you're interested, look for Our Lady of Clearwater. But just understand that it's not approved by the Catholic Church. But there's a lot of people that were there and praying there, and I think there's still a chapel there. There was also another Marian apparition in Necedah, Wisconsin, and this was in April of 1950. And I want to talk about that just to give you some idea of, what the church goes through to try and approve an apparition. This one in Necedah was shot down, but there's still proponents that believe in it and have written books about it. So then in the final episode, what I'd like to do is compare these apparitions to other appearances or other signs in the world. Because the question I had as an observer is, if all of these Marian apparitions have taken place, and of course have received a lot of attention and books and study throughout the world by both Catholic and Christian communities, then what about other faiths and other traditions? Have they experienced similar apparitions by maybe the Blessed Mother, or does the Blessed Mother only appear to Catholics? Or if she only appears to Catholics, do other gods or figures step in for these other faiths, these other figures that are important to that faith and who might better represent their belief system? Honestly, I've come to believe, I don't even get into that right now, but I've come to believe that what we see is what we expect to see or what we want to see, and that goes for these apparitions. But anyway, that'll be the final episode. So hopefully you'll be able to hang in there with me. Again, I'll keep these short, about 15 minutes. I can't listen to a podcast that's much longer than that, but I'll try to summarize what I'm talking about and also ask the kind of questions that you might want to ask. Just basic questions. As I've mentioned, I'm not a theologian or a Marian apparitions expert, but I think there are things that you might want to ask. That's what I'll discuss as part of the examination of these events. So thank you for listening. And again, you can reach me at mike@mikenicholas.com. My website is mikenicholas.com. And look forward to speaking to you again soon and continuing this investigation of the apparitions of the Blessed Mother. Thank you. Bye-bye.